The Chesapeake, a vast estuary nestled between Maryland and Virginia, became a strategic stronghold for the British. They captured Tangier Island, transforming it into a base for raids and harassment along the bay. These raids, while disruptive, were merely a prelude to a much larger operation. As the war raged on, Tangier Island also became a haven for refugees, particularly enslaved individuals seeking freedom under British protection. A formal policy known as the Cochrane Proclamation solidified Britain's commitment to providing shelter and evacuation to those fleeing the United States. But the British had more than just raids in mind. They were meticulously planning for a renewed offensive. The stage was set for a dramatic escalation of the conflict, with the Chesapeake Campaign poised to bring the war to the American capital itself. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived, to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends: Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit Series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. The last episode left off after the Battle of Lundy's Lane, the bloodiest battle fought during the War of 1812. While it was tactically a stalemate, the battle would ultimately see the end of American attempts to evade Upper Canada via the Niagara Peninsula for the remainder of the war. While the movements and battles were happening between the two sides along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, the British were causing havoc along the Atlantic seaboard. Starting in March of 1813, the British had controlled the waterways of the Chesapeake Bay. For those not familiar with the geography of the area, the Chesapeake Bay is located between the states of Maryland and Virginia. It is separated from the Atlantic Ocean by what is called the Delmarva Peninsula, a portmanteau of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. A number of rivers flow into the bay, which is the largest estuary in the United States. This includes the Potomac River, which flows through Washington, D.C., as well as the Patuxent River and the Rappahannock River. Just inside the peninsula, when heading north on the waters towards Baltimore, is Tangier Island. The island was captured by the British in early 1813, and it became a staging point for the coming months. From the island, a British task force under the command of Rear Admiral George Cockburn would harass the Americans along the bay. This included battles at places such as Frenchtown on April 29, 1813, or Fredericktown on May 5th of that year. These raids continued into the summer of 1813 before the British would fall back to the island and continue to hold it, hemming in any American ships that were there. While the British were on the island, they would construct Fort Albion. This fort would be a barracks for the men and had around 1,200 troops. It would also serve as a refuge for slaves. In 1813, the British Army and the British Navy were instructed to provide shelter, protection, and evacuation for refugees, no matter who they were. This would become formally adopted into a policy in April of 1814, when Admiral Alexander Cochrane, who was in command of the North American Station of the British Navy, issued what became known as the Cochrane Proclamation. It read, quote, "Whereas it has been represented to me that many persons now resident in the United States have expressed a desire to withdraw therefrom with a view of entering into His Majesty's service, or of being received as free settlers into some of His Majesty's colonies, this is therefore to give notice, that those who may be disposed to emigrate from the United States will, with their families, be received on board His Majesty's ships or vessels of war, or at the military posts that may be established upon or near the coast of the United States, when they will have their choice of either entering into His Majesty's sea or land forces, or of being sent as free settlers to the British possessions in North America or the West Indies, where they will be met with due encouragement. Given under my hand at Bermuda this 2nd day of April 1814, Alexander Cochrane. By command of the Vice Admiral William Balachet, God save the King. Port Albion would become not just a home for the soldiers, but would also accommodate the civilians who wanted to be free. Now, the raids in 1813 never really amounted to much. The troops were just generally sacking towns along the coast and destroying foundries and artillery batteries. When the British chose to fall back to Tangier Island for the winter, they also took soundings for the bay. They marked it with buoys for things like channels and sandbars. They were putting things in place to renew the hostilities the following year. In April of 1814, the British suddenly found themselves with a lot more troops at their disposal. This was due to the victory in the Napoleonic Wars. With the massive troops and a clamor from the British public to put the upstart Americans into place, more and more men would now be free. The British would send most of the veterans of the wars in Europe to Canada, where the Governor-General of Canada, Sir George Prevost, was preparing for an offensive into New York. There were 2,500 men, though, who were dispatched at first to Bermuda under the command of Major General Robert Ross. These men were some of the best. They had served fighting against the French in Spain under Duke of Wellington. They were no strangers to combat and knew how to execute a war. With the plan for the attack into New York from Upper and Lower Canada through the Lake Champlain region, a diversion would be needed. What better way to distract the Americans than by harassing their capital region? The plan started to come together in the summer of 1814, shortly after the Battle of Lundy's Lane. Cochrane would be the one to draw up the plan with some input from Ross and Cockburn. Cockburn was in favor of attacking Washington straight away, while Ross, lacking things like cavalry and artillery, wanted to ensure a defensive flotilla in the bay was taken care of first so they would have the Navy at their disposal. The plans were drawn up, and the Chesapeake Campaign escalated from just harassment of the Americans in the area to bringing the war to a part of the country that had thus far been unaffected. 2 forces would be dispatched from Tangier Island to be diversions for the troops under Ross. The HMS Menelaus, a frigate with 46 guns, would go with some smaller crafts to fake an attack on Baltimore, drawing attention to themselves. The task was described by Midshipman Frederick Chamier. Our duty consisted in an internal annoyance of the enemy, and therefore night and day we were employed in offensive operations. The other prong of the diversion was a pair of frigates, some bomb catches, and a rocket ship sent up the Potomac. Now, I know what you're thinking when you hear the phrase rocket ship, but this was a ship that was equipped with Congreve rockets, not the type of rocket ship that comes to mind today. Although it would have been a much different situation if the British rocket ship... Never mind. Back to the actual timeline of what was happening in the war. The rest of the Navy would head up to Patuxent, which was where the Chesapeake Bay flotilla was holed up. Ross and his men disembarked at Benedict on August 19th and proceeded to march upstream with the ships under Cockburn sailing alongside them. The British reached Nottingham 2 days later, and the Americans opted to destroy the gunboats of the Chesapeake flotilla and retreat overland to Washington, instead of confronting the British force. Ross took his men to Upper Marlborough, where he had to make a decision. He could march on to Baltimore or over to Washington. He chose to give his men a night of rest on August 23rd, and that was when the decision was made that they would march on the capital. The force the British had wasn't exactly small. There were 4 infantry battalions, a battalion of Royal Marines, and about 200 men from the Colonial Marines, which was composed primarily of black refugees. There was also a rocket detachment, 50 sappers, 100 gunners from the Navy, and 475 sailors. In all, there was roughly 4,370 men. Now we're going to jump back just a little bit and talk about what was happening in Washington, D.C. while the British were preparing for their offensive. President James Madison called for the cabinet on July 1st. With the British sending troops over and the mouth to the Chesapeake Bay under British control, they surmised an attack on the area was likely. The Secretary of War, John Armstrong, actually said he thought it was unlikely the British would even think of attacking Washington itself. He thought Baltimore was the more logical target since it was a key port. On July 2nd, Madison declared the Washington and Baltimore areas the 10th Military District and appointed Brigadier General William Winder as the commander. Now, Winder is a familiar name to those who have been following along since the beginning of the series. He was one of the officers at the Battle of Stony Creek. and was captured when he literally walked right into a group of British soldiers. He had recently been released as part of a prisoner exchange and was now back in Washington. On July 5th, Winder has suggested to Armstrong that the militia be called up in advance of an attack, but Armstrong didn't want to do that, noting it was better for the militia to be used at the spur of the moment. Winder would spend much of the next month visiting the forts and communities within his command. However, despite a fear that the British could attack at any time, he made no preparations against it. The morning of the 24th of August in 1814, Ross made his move towards Washington. There were two routes he could take. One was from the south and the other from the east. The way south would have involved trying to cross an unfordable part of the Anacostia River. Ross would initially make a feint towards this direction before changing his course and moving north towards Bladensburg. Winder realized what could happen and what had happened, and as of the 20th of August, he had put men into position to engage the British at Upper Marlborough. The two sides skirmished on the 22nd, and the Americans were ordered to pull back. Winder was afraid of a night attack, like the one that had resulted in his capture just a year earlier in Stony Creek, and it was then that Winder realized the importance of Bladensburg strategically. It commanded the roads to Annapolis and Baltimore. It was also on one of the two routes that could be used to attack Washington. He ordered for reinforcements to come from Baltimore to Bladensburg, and they arrived on the 22nd, deploying at Loudon's Hill. Artillery was put into place, and they would command the intersection of the roads that connect Washington, Georgetown, and Baltimore. In the early morning of the 23rd, Winder sent a message to the officer in charge of the defenses at Bladensburg, Brigadier General Tobias Stansbury. Winder advised that he had withdrawn over the Anacostia and was destroying the bridge behind them. And it was then that Stansbury made one of the dumbest moves in the entire war. He held every single strategic position in Bladensburg. But for some reason, he immediately marched his troops back to a brickyard 2.5 kilometers away. He threw every single advantage he had on the battlefield in the middle of the night away. While this positioning was taking place in Washington, government records were being packed up and taken to other places in Maryland and Virginia in case the British did press onwards. Winder had at his disposal around 1,000 regular troops and 7,000 militiamen. These militia, though, would prove to be less than dependable. Stansbury set his men up on the west side of the river opposite the town. Artillery was set up in an earthwork to the north of the bridge over the river. The militia regiments from Maryland would be set up in a line of battle south of the artillery earthworks, too far away to protect the artillery and exposed to British fire as they crossed the bridge. The situation would see some involvement from Winder to reposition the men, albeit it wasn't exactly into a better position, and it didn't help that the Secretary of State, James Monroe, would also start issuing some orders. He called for 120 dragoons to occupy a ravine behind the infantry, but then they were left with no orders about what to do after they got there. A brigade of militia from the District of Columbia would be posted along a crest of rising ground, but thanks to a lack of communication, that crest of ground was a mile away from everyone else, and so they would end up providing little support if needed. As well, the American forces were tired. It was a hot, humid summer day, and they had been constantly on the move, deploying and redeploying, positioning, repositioning. Then around noon on the afternoon of the 24th, the British arrived at Bladensburg. The error by Stansbury to pull back from Loudon's Hill became apparent. If he had held the position, the British would have paid dearly through their advance. Instead, Stansbury was too far back to contest the crossing of the Anacostia by the British. The 85th Light Infantry, under the command of Colonel William Thornton, was the first to cross the bridge. 3 other companies of light infantry accompanied them. They would be initially pushed back, but they would try again and crossed over, establishing a bridgehead. They started to advance in a loose order with a lot of space between the men, and this made solid shot from the American artillery ineffective. Thornton's men moved in and pushed the artillery back. Now, while this was happening, another British regiment forded the river upstream from the bridge, and they were ready to envelop the left wing of the American defenses. Winder led a counterattack against the light infantry, but when the Congreve rockets began to fall on the Americans, the conscripted militiamen broke and fled. Then, in a panic, the 5th Maryland Militia and all of Stansbury's men fled the scene as well. And when they retreated, they took the dragoons with them. The rout turned into chaos. The Americans hadn't even considered what could happen in case of a retreat or a defeat. Winder would issue contradicting orders as he tried to get men to form up. He also ordered the men to flee to the capital in Washington so that they could use the government buildings as defensive works. But then he ordered the men to retreat through Georgetown. The result was thousands of men fleeing with no destination in mind. Despite the British victory, they did suffer many more casualties than the Americans, and this was in part due to a stand made by sailors under the command of Commodore Joshua Barney, who were manning artillery that was overlooking the battlefield. The conditions of the day also played a factor. It was reported the British had 64 men die during the battle and 185 wounded. Many of the dead, though, died without any injuries. They had succumbed to the heat and exhaustion after 5 days of marching before the battle. The Americans would see around 12 men killed and 40 wounded. There were about another 100 or so captured. The aftermath of the battle, though, would become known as the Bladensburg Races. The American militia fled through the streets of Washington. President Madison and his cabinet had been observing the battle, and they had to flee to avoid capture, and they ended up fleeing to various parts of Maryland and Virginia. Madison actually ended up spending the night in the home of a silversmith named Caleb Bentley in Brookville. The British now had a wide open path to the American capital. As the British approached, we now visit back to a letter from George Prevost to Cochrane back on June 2nd, after the burning of Port Dover in Upper Canada. Prevost wrote, "In consequence of the late disgraceful conduct of the American troops in the wanton destruction of private property on the north shores of Lake Erie, in order that if war with the United States continues, you may, should you judge it advisable, assist in inflicting that measure of retaliation which shall deter the enemy from a repetition of similar outrages." Cochrane himself wrote, "I am most decidedly of opinion that the readiest way to attain this object is to bring home to the supporters of the government which authorizes this unnatural system of warfare a full share of its dreadful calamities, and to this end I have issued to the commanding officer of His Majesty's blockading squadron an order, accompanied by a secret memorandum. Whereas it appears that the American troops in Upper Canada have committed the most wanton and unjustifiable outrages on the unoffending inhabitants by burning their mills and houses, and by a general devastation of private property, you are hereby required and directed to destroy and lay waste such towns and districts as you may find assailable. You will hold strictly in view the conduct of the American army towards His Majesty's unoffending Canadian subjects, and you will spare merely the lives of the unarmed inhabitants of the United States." As the British entered Washington, D.C., the destruction would begin. Cockburn called for the burning of the entire city. However, Ross chose to only order for the burning of the public buildings, leaving the homes of the citizens untouched. The Capitol building would be one of the first destroyed as troops sacked it. The Library of Congress, which was housed in the building at the time, lost to fire. The building, however, would not be a complete loss. The rotunda, the east lobby, and the staircases survived. The troops then turned northwest on Pennsylvania Avenue and headed for the White House. The wife of the president, Dolly Madison, took what she could hold and fled, along with the staff of the house. One of those was Paul Jennings, a 15-year-old slave at the time. He recounted the escape in his memoirs, written in 1865. It has often been stated in print that when Mrs. Madison escaped from the White House, she cut out from the frame the large portrait of Washington, now in one of the parlors there, and carried it off. She had no time for doing it. It would have required a ladder to get it down. All she carried off was the silver in her reticule, as the British were thought to be but a few squares off and expected any moment. He added, John Suze and McGraw, the president's gardener, took it down and sent it off on a wagon with some large silver urns and such other valuables that could be hastily got hold of. When the British did arrive, they ate up the very dinner and drank the wines that I had prepared for the president's party. The British would add even more fuel into the president's home in the hope that it would continue burning into the next day. Now that next day, the 25th, Cockburn entered the offices of the National Intelligencer, one of the newspapers in Washington, with the goal of burning it down. Some of the women from the neighborhood, though, asked that they not burn it so that there was no risk of the fire spreading. Instead, Cockburn gave the order for the building to be torn down and all the presses smashed. The Treasury building destroyed, as was the Department of War building. The only government building in D.C. that was left untouched was the Patent Office. Now, as the razing of Washington continued, a sudden, severe thunderstorm came through. The storm is now considered by many to have been a hurricane. It also spawned a tornado that passed through the city. The destruction of the storm spared no one, with Americans and British killed. As the storm subsided, the British would return to their ships, many of which had been damaged by the storm. After just 26 hours, the British had left the city. Now, time to play Debbie Downer when it comes to the mythos of the burning of Washington. The first is that the closely held legend in Canada is it was troops from Canada who marched down to Washington and burned the White House, then proceeded to return to Canada. The fact of the matter is, there were no Canadians involved in the raid on Washington. The entire Chesapeake Campaign was carried out by British soldiers from Britain, along with colonial Marines who were mainly refugees from slavery. The whole campaign in the Chesapeake was meant as a distraction so that an offensive could be launched from the Canadas into New York, and that is where the Canadian militia was, ready to go on the attack. So as much as the burning of Washington is used as a source of pride amongst Canadians in so many debates with Americans, it wasn't the Canadians. Another myth is that the burning of the White House was how it got its name. After the fire caused scorch marks on the walls, it had to be painted white, and it was painted pink previously. And this was not true either. In fact, the walls had to be reconstructed entirely after the fire. They received way too much damage. The building had been called the President's Palace, the Presidential Mansion, and the President's House regularly, but the first time it was ever called the White House was in 1811, 3 years before the fire. It was officially called the Executive Mansion up until 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt issued an executive order that changed the formal name to the White House. Now, the next myth is more of a legend on the American side of the fighting. With the city of Washington, at least the government buildings, all on fire, a severe thunderstorm came through and saved the buildings by dousing them with water, extinguishing the flames. This thunderstorm, as mentioned, is believed to have been a hurricane, and it didn't really save anything. In fact, with many of the buildings already damaged by the fire, they were now exposed to the elements, and the storm caused even more damage. And the storm caused extensive damage to buildings that the British had left untouched, such as the Patent Office and homes in the area. In reality, the storm made things worse. An encounter was described by Peter Snow in the book When Britain Burned the White House, written in 2012. The encounter was between Coburn and a woman from Washington, retelling the scenario. "Dear God, is this the weather to which you are accustomed in this infernal country?" inquired the Admiral. "It is a special interposition of Providence to drive our enemies from our city," the woman allegedly called out to Coburn. "Not so, madam," Coburn retorted. "It is rather to aid your enemies in the destruction of your city." Before he rode off on horseback. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we'll take a closer look at the rest of the Chesapeake Campaign, including the Battle of Baltimore and how the United States got its national anthem. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more hidden histories, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.